Okay. So that is just preparing for the live stream. All right. So guys, welcome. Maybe I won't start until we know for sure it's actually up. Yeah. So welcome everyone to our conversation today with Emma DeSouza. She's a human rights campaigner. We're going to be talking about her own story, why she got involved with this, and of course then what a pro-Brexit, or a post-Brexit Northern Ireland will look like. Emma is involved with the National Women's Council of Ireland. She's the Vice Chair and Northern Ireland spokesperson at votingrights.ie. She's a board member of 50/50 Northern Ireland and a member of the Equality Coalition. She's a freelance writer and a political commentator, as well as a public speaker, and she's currently writing a book, so we'll hear a little bit about that too. And she's the founder and campaign manager of the We Are Irish 2 campaign, which was successful and kind of what brought you to my attention, Emma, when we met at the consulate in New York, was in bringing forward these legislative changes which resulted in a change in domestic UK immigration law. And so absolutely human rights, social justice, immigration, these are all the kind of areas that you work in at the moment. So welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Good. Well, so I suppose we should, it's an open-ended question, and I'm sure it'll be a long enough story, but will you tell us, exactly what happened? I know you met and fell in love with an American, and that led to all kinds of complications in your life that you probably weren't expecting. Because am I right in thinking you thought at the time that in the post-Good Friday Agreement world that you would be able to, call yourself an Irish citizen, which would make it easier for your husband to get a European residency card. So talk to us about all of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was someone who was not politically active in any way. And so my understanding of things like the Good Friday Agreement were quite cursory. I was quite young when the Good Friday Agreement was voted on. And then, yes, I did think that the right to be accepted as Irish or British or both, which forms an integral part of the Good Friday Agreement, was a right that was legislated for in law. And as you say, I fell in love with an American, and then he fell in love with Northern Ireland. I mean, I thought we were going to go live in Los Angeles, but no. He had to come live here. And we started the process then of getting his visa. We expected that this would be a relatively simple process because all Irish EU citizens in the United Kingdom were able to access their rights under EU family reunification law. And I've only ever held an Irish passport, so I didn't anticipate any kind of problems in terms of being able to access that right. And it was really quite surreal and surprising to be told by the British Home Office that they actually considered me to be a British citizen, and that I wouldn't be able to sponsor my husband's visa unless I renounced to this British citizenship that I had never claimed. And the process for doing that was a system where I'd have to declare myself as British on the form. Then I'd have to go through a process of proving that I was British. And then I'd have to give up my Irish passport for 6 months. And the whole thing was really quite onerous, and it costs £372. Process society where issues around identity are quite sensitive, and you're asking Irish citizens to declare themselves as British, to not be British, it's not a good system. So we originally appealed that decision, thinking that it would actually be overturned quite quickly, and it was going to be some sort of clerical error in the British Home Office where they didn't understand that Northern Ireland has different rights than the rest of the UK, and it would be easily rectified. We were very wrong. It ended up being a 5-year court case that took him. We went through various rounds in court. A grassroots kind of political campaign came through that as well. So we started getting a lot of support from political parties, majority in Northern Ireland, the Irish government, the Labour Party. I was over there in the US knocking doors as well and got support from both sides of the house. So it became quite a big campaign and case in the end. And I think that level of interest and pressure resulted in the British government changing legislation to address our case and the issue that we were highlighting. So it was 2 years ago when they changed domestic UK immigration law to allow all citizens in Northern Ireland to be considered EU citizens for immigration purposes. And they, reaffirmed that right to be accepted as Irish or British or both. So it was a significant win. Yeah. It did mean that families all across Northern Ireland were able to be reunited. and being able to even help one family to be able to stay together is an incredible feeling. So it was very hard, but it was definitely worth it.
And so, of course, my brain can't keep up with all of this. When did Brexit happen? Like, did Brexit have an impact then on this? Because, of course, now, and does it still hold that Northern Irish citizens are technically Irish citizens, which makes them members of the EU still, or how has Brexit affected all of that?
Brexit did impact it in the sense that with Brexit, rights to EU family reunification law ended and free movement ended within the UK. So the UK government did have a system, the EU settlement scheme, which allowed EU citizens and people of Northern Ireland to continue to access family reunification rights for a period of time. But that has now closed due to Brexit. So it was a window that was opened for a short period of time, but it does set a legal precedent that can be used in case law going forward in terms of trying to reaffirm that right to be accepted as Irish or British or both. So it may not be over yet.
Yeah. And Emma, while you were going through, did you say 4 or 5 years of this case? Was it divisive at home in Northern Ireland, or were people sort of happy to think, well, the Good Friday Agreement said we could claim one or the other, or kind of a hybrid, or was there pushback from, maybe the DUP or unionists?
Of course, there was pushback from the DUP. They were the only party to push back. It's also, I have to say this every time when I talk about this, is that the DUP were also the only major political party to campaign against the Good Friday Agreement. So it can be a little surprised that they took an issue with someone reaffirming their rights under the Good Friday Agreement. But it was disappointing for me that there was that kind of pushback, because the issue that we were dealing with didn't just impact Irish citizens, because it was an immigration situation, so it was impacting also those who identify as British. And a lot of people came to me who were going through the same problems. And a lot of them were those who identified as British. And what they were actually doing was they were renouncing their British citizenship, the only identity they felt they had, and actually claiming Irish citizenship to try and keep their families together. Yeah. So they were going through quite a difficult situation as well. And they didn't have political representation to sort of stand up for them. So there was, of course, with these things in Northern Ireland, when you come to anything around rights or equality, there can be pushback, and we did experience that to a degree. But all by and large, the support we had was good and did support what we were trying to achieve.
And so, look, I suppose, we've brought up the dreaded topic, Brexit. It's something I think that fascinates Americans. We've had a number of talks over the years on Brexit, and will it happen, and then it happened, and what will happen now, and protocol and border, polls and the whole shebang. What is happening there now? I know you ran for election yourself this year as an independent. Fraught, I guess. I think we were watching it at this side of the Atlantic, kind of thinking, was it going to be more like the SDLP or those middle of the road compromise parties? And in fact, no, the DUP and Sinn Féin are both still, although now Sinn Féin has taken over, I guess, as the number one, party. So what will happen, do you think, there? Like, they're in negotiations still to form a government, because the DUP at the moment refused to power share. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, there's a couple of things to unpack. So I suppose in the first instance, Brexit and its impact. Brexit does disrupt the delicate equilibrium of the peace process, and it actually really impacts people's identity, because what it has done is it's kind of undermined that principle of parity of esteem. Irish citizens and British citizens in Northern Ireland have two different sets of rights now. And that does undermine that provision of trying to have that mutual respect and parity of esteem between the two communities. But it's also created, I suppose, a hardening of identity as well. We see that some communities are becoming more entrenched as a result of Brexit. And then we're also seeing significant shifts in terms of where people are going in terms of their passports, for example. We're seeing a massive rise in those applying for Irish passports and a decrease in those applying for British passports. So there has been a big shift in identity. And I think you raised also about our case and that sort of implications around people saying, oh, but we have this right to be Irish or British or both. And what our case did is actually kind of highlighted the fact that these kind of really important provisions around identity and citizenship have not been put into legislation. And the vast majority of people thought this was taken care of and anticipated that something as important of the Good Friday Agreement would have actually been put into law, and it hasn't been. So that did raise a lot of questions around identity. And then I suppose if you look towards the election, you noted there about the SDLP and the UUP, and I suppose there might have been an anticipation that some of those more moderate middle ground parties might have been able to pick up more seats, but actually they lost significant seats. And we've seen the SDLP now in its sixth decline since 1998 at the assembly level. And at the same time, you're seeing Sinn Féin really sort of take up that space in terms of the nationalist vote share. And SDLP in particular are in a very difficult position because they're now sort of facing a twin-pronged threat, where they have the threat of Sinn Féin with the nationalist vote share, and moderate middle ground voters are going to the Alliance Party. So we're actually seeing a bit of a squeeze on the middle ground moderate parties, and sort of a three-party state in a way is kind of developing here in Northern Ireland, where you're seeing the DUP, Sinn Féin, and the Alliance Party. And that seems to be the trajectory that we're going in. And then when it comes to the election, I ran as an independent candidate. I loved the experience. It was a great way to get out into my constituency. We moved to Fermanagh about a year and a half ago. So we really got to get out, knocking doors, chatting to people, seeing how beautiful it is. I'm very pro Fermanagh because I just love living here. And it was great to be able to hear the issues that were really impacting people at the doors, and to have, I suppose, that inside scoop into how politics works in that arena. I mean, as a political nerd, being in the county centre is so much fun. So it was a great experience. But we are now back to this situation where we don't have an assembly. It's not up and running. We don't have an executive. And this is the sixth time, I think now, that the executive and the assembly have been collapsed. And I think we're getting to a point where we have to have very serious conversations over whether the way the institutions in Northern Ireland operate are effective. And if maybe we need to now look at those institutions and how they're running and find a way to make them operate where we can't be in this position where a party can just hold the entire country to ransom.
Yeah. Well, and Emma, it's so, I think I read at one point when I was preparing for one of these talks that something like 30% of the lifetime of Stormont, there has not been a government in place, which is incredible. And I mean, sometimes you might be able to kind of think, well, we'll potter along and, the under ministers are there, or some kind of an infrastructure is happening. But, to be just coming out of COVID, for instance, and to think there is no mechanism in place for like the health department to, be looking at budgeting and recovery down the road, or what happens if we get another outbreak this winter. I mean, government has to function, and some of it you can't let to the civil service or hope that England steps in and takes over. And the Northern Irish state is changing a lot. I think, did you guys repeat, we in the south, they repealed the 8th, like I know there was abortion issues being mentioned, like in the north, issues around same-sex marriage, like there's work that needs to be done kind of to progress the country. And is any of that happening?
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to human rights protections, if you look at the vast majority of human rights protections under the Good Friday Agreement, for example, the vast majority have actually not been implemented, or if they have, they've been misimplemented. And in the Good Friday Agreement, we also have this concept of North-South equivalence of rights. Back in 1998, the North was maybe a little bit ahead of the South. It's very much a different story now. And really, we are so far behind when it comes to having enforceable human rights. And we've seen that in terms of some of these issues that you're raising there in terms of abortion healthcare and access to abortion, for example. It did become legal finally in 2019. Which really is not that long ago. But we still see women having to travel to England to be able to access abortion services. There were stats released yesterday actually to say that 161 women from Northern Ireland had to travel to England in the last year. And it's really not acceptable that women are being put into this position where they can't access reproductive health care. And we have seen that even though there is now an imperative for the British government to bring forward legislation to be able to ensure that women can access abortion services, the DUP are continuing to oppose that measure and are trying as best they can to bring forward any kind of measures or mechanisms or legislation to try and water down that right and make it more difficult for women to access these services. And actually our current health minister, who is a UUP health minister, who has been amazing throughout the pandemic, his response was really great. He was very strong with the pandemic response, but he himself is anti-choice and he has been blocking the provision of services. So we're in a position here in Northern Ireland where those of us who are trying to push for equality, for human rights, are really finding it very difficult, because we're operating in a space where our political institutions can very successfully block progress.
Yeah. And I mean, even, it's amazing. You would think that they would be in line with the UK's policy, which is obviously that there's choice. And yeah, so it kind of suits them to do what they want, when it suits them. Yeah.
Stop. Yeah, no, but look, a lot of people make that point. If you look even around the debate around the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment, and the arguments that we're hearing around Northern Ireland's place in the UK, but when it comes to something they don't agree with, then it's all right to be different from the rest of the UK. So
Yeah.
there is a bit of, I suppose, it's disingenuous in terms of a lot of the narratives that are used here. And that can definitely be a point of frustration for those of us that are just trying to ensure that people have equal access to rights and justice.
Mm-hmm. We were talking, Emma, to a college professor. He's the Meyer Chair of British History and Literature, I think, down in Bard College, and he was saying that at this point it's almost more cultural in a way for the unionists and the DUP and stuff than it is actually politically expedient, because Brexit has to have been an extreme kind of wake-up call. On the one hand, like we just had Peter Maloney last week give a talk, and he showed a word cloud about the election, the Brexit, referendum, and Northern Ireland didn't even feature in the word cloud. Like, it was all taxes and NHS and money and immigrants, and and you just think, my God, like Britain or the UK, London has sort of shown over and over again that maybe Northern Ireland is not even an afterthought, in some of their policies. And yet these unionists are clinging to an identity that may not serve them anymore. I mean, Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union, so it's a very kind of strange one.
Yes,
Do you
but
think it is cultural at this point more than...
I mean, look, that Northern Ireland vote at Remain is something you don't hear often enough, and often political unionism doesn't acknowledge that did happen. And I think it is coming down to a cultural thing, and you've highlighted a really good point in terms of the fact that we are an afterthought. Absolutely, we are an afterthought. And if you look at the Brexit debate around that, you can see that. And I think there was also a poll done with the Conservative membership where over 50%, 56% or something said they would rather have Brexit than Northern Ireland. So, there have been time and time again, there has been evidence demonstrated that, maybe England would be glad to be shot of the North sometimes. And I think that creates an insecurity, I suppose, within unionism, that they're in that position where they aren't being recognized as how they would like to be within the United Kingdom. And I suppose if you look at it from their perspective, that probably is quite challenging and quite frustrating to be in that situation. But it would be better, I think, for those of us here in Northern Ireland to be able to work on building relationships with each other, and working together to try and create a community where, we're taking care of one another, versus trying to aspire for Westminster, who really are just pushing for a very hard Brexit. If you look at any of the legislation that's been coming through recently, it's really prioritizing Westminster and a very English nationalist agenda when it comes to Brexit. And really, Northern Ireland and our peace process is just a bargaining chip that's being used by the government.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, the Irish government, what's his name, Simon Coveney, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence last week, had kind of strong words for what he felt was, I don't think he called it intransigent, but almost like a not willing to engage at all, with on behalf of the UK government. He had that 12-minute phone call that was not productive, I think was how he put it, and so there's kind of an unwillingness, I think, on the part of the British government to even deal with the Dublin government, about it, because the Good Friday Agreement is international law. Like, it's, the Americans certainly support it, I think. It's kind of, you're wondering where they're going with this, like, because I don't think the British government will get any more concessions out of Europe. Like, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, you're raising there that the Good Friday Agreement is international law. And we've seen that this government, the current British government, does show a bit of disregard for international law. And I feel sometimes like one of the least surprised people, because my case and what I went through for those 5 years was based around the fact that the Good Friday Agreement is international law, and the British government has an obligation under international law to ensure its domestic legislation is in line with its international commitments. They argued that because the right to be Irish or British or both was not part of domestic UK legislation, that they weren't bound by international law. They weren't obligated to follow it. There was nothing to force them to follow their obligations under international law. So I really feel sometimes quite unsurprised by their actions when it comes to how they perceive their obligations under international law, because I already saw that myself in terms of how they perceive the Good Friday Agreement. And I think we are in a very difficult space. I don't think that the European Union is going to give much more. And you can understand why. It's like we're all trapped in Groundhog's Day in terms of just being stuck in this space where we're always talking about Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and trying to get concessions or mitigations or changes. And, the European Union has 27 countries that really have a lot of pretty big issues to also be dealing with, such as the war in Ukraine. So I think it is getting to a point where there's only so much that they can really do to accommodate what is the British government essentially saying, this is what we want, and you have to give us what we want, or we're just like out of here, Yeah. So I think we're in a very tense space, and the Irish government is in a very difficult position because there's only so much they can do. And they're in a difficult position also with issues around the Good Friday Agreement as well, because there is no dispute mechanism in the Good Friday Agreement. And I suppose looking back, perhaps that is something that might have been beneficial. So there was a mechanism in there for whenever there's, wanton disregard for the agreement or a failure to comply with the agreement, but we don't have that. So basically, Dublin is in a position where it has to try to negotiate with London and convince them that this is something they need to prioritize. And the government we have at the moment is just on its own path.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, well, and it's almost, like for Boris Johnson, I think with all this Partygate and everything, like COVID kind of has been a godsend, for him in a way, because it keeps taking the focus off, his own kind of failings as a leader. And even with the Northern Ireland, that I'm like, am I right in thinking, Emma, that life on the ground there is kind of has settled down, like because the border is now theoretically in the Irish Sea, there's more trade with the south, between the north and the south together. I mean, we now know that Northern Ireland is trading kind of with mainland Europe easier than they can almost with mainland Britain. So in fact, I think the Northern Irish economy is probably doing much better than we anticipated. But the flip side of that, I suppose, is how technically, like how small that economy is and how dependent on outside, like, they get a lot of support, from America and from the European Union, like on subsidies and things. Do you think that will be something that will factor into the fact that life is kind of going on as normal, aside from peace? If the economy is good, will Northern Ireland just be happy to sort of let Brexit happen while Northern Ireland has this kind of soft membership still of the EU?
I think that there's definitely an appetite for that. I would say that the vast majority of people are just getting on with life, and we all have our own concerns and struggles and hopes and dreams. And that's what most people are caught up with, not what's happening with the Northern Ireland Protocol. They're not going to be trailing through the legislation like the rest of us nerds, and going through that. So I think that certainly it's not a pressing issue for people. It's more of a political issue. And it's being amplified quite a lot by the media as well in terms of any opposition to the protocol. But we are seeing significant shifts in economic growth. We're seeing reports that Northern Ireland is doing better than other parts of the United Kingdom. We're seeing a significant shift in trade in terms of north-south trade. And also we're seeing a lot of local businesses getting pretty big deals. Like we've seen companies like Deli Lights, who are a sandwich company, who are now being able to supply sandwiches to the big supermarkets like Super Value, Lidl, Asda, Tesco. Now, previously, these big supermarkets would have been using English sandwich companies. And now they're having to use local Northern Irish companies. And that can only be a good thing if we're being able to get more jobs, more businesses, and more more into the economy here, it will have a trickle-down effect in terms of to the wider Northern Irish economy. Because I think that what we have seen over the last 25 years is perhaps the peace dividend that we expected in many areas hasn't really delivered. And really, we've been quite stuck in terms of economic growth. The protocol does present us with an opportunity to really make Northern Ireland an economic powerhouse. And we're seeing a lot of interest in foreign direct investment. So it's a huge opportunity. And I think that's part of the reason why there is this push from the British government to try and scrap it. Because in a way, the success of the Northern Ireland Protocol actually highlights the failures of Brexit. Because we've seen Boris Johnson say, oh, it's the war in Ukraine, or it's the global food shortages, or it's COVID, and listing a whole load of reasons as to why British economy is doing so poorly. But when you see how Northern Ireland is faring in comparison, you can see that actually, no, it is Brexit. That's why it is such a dismal place. Yeah. So I think that's part of the motivation. And I did note that Lord Frost did say quite recently at an event that he was speaking at, that they saw the fact that North-South trade was booming and English companies were being cut off from Northern Ireland, and these other companies in Northern Ireland were getting the contracts instead. They saw that as a problem they wanted to rectify. So really, I think it's about securing business for British companies, not for Northern Irish companies. And I think that we really need to seize that as an opportunity. And it's a bit confusing too when you think about the opposition from unionist representatives to the protocol, because if Northern Ireland is an economic success, then people are going to be happy in Northern Ireland, so it does change the conversations. And I do wonder sometimes why they don't utilize that.
And it kind of takes the pressure off maybe even unification with the South, like if the state is functioning, and thriving, then maybe we don't need to have a border poll, and like if there's this space for it to exist on its own successfully, I think that might just take the pressure off. And while we talk about that, you mentioned the peace dividend. I thought that was a really excellent point. I've read around the time that Lyra, the journalist, was killed again, that there's this whole generation of kids that have grown up only knowing peace, and yet there is kind of this huge rates of depression in Northern Ireland among young people, which I don't know if that's related to COVID or not. This kind of maybe vague resurgence of violence, or certainly with a tendency to identify. Now, look, you could argue, this country, we're having hearings at the moment that talk about, white boys and nationalism and all those. So, I don't know is it part of a global masculinity thing, that's happening. But how is Northern Ireland in terms of the youth and peace? Are they as committed to peace in the way somebody my generation, who grew up with the Troubles being daily on the news, is it a reality for them, this peace thing? And then let's talk about unification, and if you think that's likely or even something that we can kind of wrap our heads around.
I mean, look, I think that when we talk about the peace dividend, we, if you looked at some of the areas that were most impacted by the Troubles, a lot of the border areas, places like Derry, for example, or areas like East Belfast, North Belfast, West Belfast as well. These areas are still suffering from systemic social and economic deprivation. And really, these communities have been failed over the last 25 years in terms of the investment into these communities. And it then plays out into a whole new generation who are growing up without social and economic opportunities in an environment where they don't have access to the services that they need to be able to build a successful life. And that's where we're seeing, I suppose, a bit of a resurgence in trouble. We saw last year there were some protests around the Northern Ireland Protocol where buses were being burned, and there was some rioting. And it was framed as being actually about opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol. But in the end, it was 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds that were arrested. And I don't know too many 12-year-olds who understand the complexities of trade agreements at an international level. These instances of violence are erupting in some of the most deprived areas of Northern Ireland. And that's where the trouble is stemming from for that reason, because they don't have the investment and the services they need. So I think that we need to reinvest in these communities, and it all stems from politics.
Yeah, I
We
was
don't
just going
have
to
a
say
functioning political system
another
here.
reason for Stormont to get the
This
fingers
is
out.
it,
Yeah.
and there's still quite a lot of us versus them in our political institutions, and then we see that being played out in terms of funding, and we don't see the funding being prioritized into these areas. So it's something that really needs to be totally overhauled if we're serious about trying to reach some of the darkest corners of Northern Ireland and give people a good start in life. Then we need to be investing into these areas, and with that comes a more sustainable peace.
Mm-hmm. And so, Emma, the big overhang, of course, of the whole thing is reunification. And I'm not kind of, asking you personally. I will disclose, like I'm from County Kerry. I certainly didn't grow up in a very Republican, household, or because we were so far away, I suppose, in one way, it wasn't something that was on my family's, radar. I suppose, you grow up Irish, sort of half thinking, oh, well, someday we'll be united, without ever actually putting, much thought into what that would look like. And of course, in the last couple of years, because talk has accelerated around that, I remember one of our own government ministers said, like a reunited Ireland is not going to be your grandfather's Ireland. Like maybe the flag will have to be changed, maybe the national anthem will have to be changed. And so I think, I don't know if Southern Irish have, thought that we are going to have to compromise or sort of change, our own constitution, or does the Parliament stay in Dublin? Like there'll be a whole thing that we'll all have to go through to see what would a united Ireland, look like. And so, do you think this is something that anyone in the north is working towards, or is the baby step to get Stormont up and running first?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, yes, we need Stormont up and running first as a first priority.
Yeah.
But I do think that more and more people are looking at the possibility of reunification through a different lens. I think there was a time where perhaps it would just have been like a romantic dream for nationalists to see the island reunified. But now, because of Brexit, it does change the conversation, because now a united Ireland is EU membership.
Yeah.
Which brings with it more benefits and opportunities for your children,
Yeah.
and for yourself. It's an economic question now as well, in terms of, are we going to be economically better off in United Ireland? And people are thinking about that. And then, of course, there's the social aspect in terms of social rights and justice. The fact that we are in a position in Northern Ireland where there's still so much contention around things like the Irish language, just coming down to just basically about equality and respect for cultures. I think that pushes more and more people into a space of considering, well, you know what, like, what's the alternative? Because this is not working. And I think if you look at, the Good Friday Agreement again, and you look at what's happened since 1998, we've had 7 subsequent agreements. We've had the Stormont House Agreement, we've had New Decade, New Approach, we've had, agreements continuing throughout this time, and not one of those agreements has actually been fully implemented. The process that we are in Northern Ireland is that an agreement is made, commitments are made, and then they're not delivered. And then the cycle just starts all over again. And I think people are becoming increasingly frustrated with that kind of politics and that kind of system, and looking for an alternative. And we have seen a lot of conversations shifting, and we see a lot more groups opening up now. We've seen a lot of groups like Ireland's Future who are campaigning for United Ireland. We're seeing groups also coming now for staying in the union. I think that's a good thing. I think it's great that unionism is going to engage in that conversation, and they should be making a case, or a positive case, for why people should stay in the UK. But we're also seeing an academic shift as well. It's actually good timing for you to ask me this question, because I was at an event today which was around gendering the conversation around Irish unity and ensuring that women's voice is a part of that conversation or constitutional change. So I spent the day in a room full of women talking about why we need to change the world. So it was a very good space to be in. But it showed you, in terms of the fact that, that's a university project. It's been going on for 2 years. And these kinds of projects would not have been happening 5 years ago. But there are several projects of that nature happening across the island. And it just shows you that we are now entering into that space where we need to start having more serious conversations around what a United Ireland might actually look like. And in terms of my own background, I mean, I grew up in a family where there were no politics. There was no, nationalism and unionism were not terms I knew growing up. My family did a very good job of keeping us quite sheltered from the politics that we grew up around. And so it wasn't something that I personally was either, aspiring for. If you'd asked me also 5 years ago, my position, I wouldn't have necessarily had a very strong position. But now I am a very strong advocate for United Ireland. And I do believe that we're entering into a space where we need to plan accordingly, because look at what has happened with Brexit. And the thing is that a United Ireland question will be far more complicated. If you look at the Scottish example, they took 2 years to put together their plan on what Scottish independence would look like. I think it would actually take a lot longer for Ireland to have a plan on what a United Ireland might look like, because there's the complexity of the past, there's the trauma of the past, there's the complexity around identity, and how do you have those conversations? And I think that if you look also towards some of the polling, we've seen that there is a difference north and south. In the north, there was a piece done with Lucid Talk where it showed that the majority of people in Northern Ireland think the Irish flag has to be changed, national anthem has to be changed, there has to be a new constitution. But in the south, there was a majority saying, no, thank you. We won't be changing the flag. We won't be changing the anthem. Since when are they all attached to the anthem?
Yeah. It's amazing because the flag was not something I had ever thought about, because that flag, we were taught that was designed specifically like peace between the green and the orange, and so what, we're going to go back to the green flag with the heart,
But I think that what we need to do is we need to create more spaces for people to be able to have dialogue. I think that if you're in an environment where we can talk about why the flag should be changed, and I do believe it should be changed, and you talk about the fact that if there's going to be United Ireland, it has to be a new Ireland. It can't just be the South subsuming the North. And it actually is a really great opportunity for people to be able to have a say in how they want to reshape and frame the society that they live in. And that should be marked by the creation of new national symbols. And it's not just about unionism, because I think a lot of the time it is framed around, we're changing the flag for unionism. And I don't think that's the case. I think we have to think about the, 900,000 people who live on the island of Ireland who weren't born here. There's a diversity of identities that are growing. It's becoming a very multicultural society. And we need to bring everybody into this conversation and look at how we can make a new inclusive Ireland for everyone. And when it comes to flags, I mean, it's very contentious in the North. There is a historical connotation with flags. And I think it's all well and good talking about how, the flag was originally intended to be, representative of the two communities and peace. But that's not what it is for a lot of people from a unionist background in Northern Ireland. And you have to recognize that trauma, that hurt, and that association. And you can't foist it on people. That's not going to get us where we need to go. So you have to be open. Everything has to be on the table. And you have to be able to find that space for compromise. I mean, that's how we got peace, was through compromise and generosity of spirit. And that's how we'll be able to find a way forward for a new Ireland. So what I'd like to see is...
I was just going to say it's a great way of looking at it for the southern point of view too, because that state need not necessarily have done great things for everybody in the south. Like, look at the hold the Catholic Church had, and so it's an opportunity for everyone to kind of have a more inclusive, as you say, and maybe like let go of the past for everybody. It's not like the free state maybe for the first 60 or 70 years, was that good for its own citizens, so
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think for me, I think the actual process of reunification will be quite cathartic for citizens, North and South, that process. And I think there's lots of ways you can make the process of a flag, you can make it kind of fun. You can try and find a way around it. I know some countries like New Zealand, for example, put the flag to a vote. And I think that would be a good option for Ireland. Say if there were 2 or 3 flags on the table and people were able to go and cast their ballot for which one they wanted. I think you need to make the processes of changing the country as inclusive and democratic as possible and get people engaged in that process. But I think what we need now in the interim, what we really need are structures such as the Civic Forum, which was part of the Good Friday Agreement and of course was disbanded after 2 years, like so many of the actions that were brought forward to progress rights and equality. It was disbanded. And I'd love to see the Civic Forum reformed here in Northern Ireland. And I think that actually I'm floating a new idea at the moment around taking it out of the political institutions completely and having civic society start the Civic Forum. Because obviously politicians and political institutions are not going to deliver this space for us. So I think perhaps maybe civic society might need to reclaim that space and actually take up that space ourselves. But I also think the Irish government has there's a need on the Irish government to be able to provide a space as well. And I know there have been quite a few calls on them creating an all-island citizens' assembly, and they're seemingly adverse to bringing forward what is, I think, a very necessary structure. It doesn't have to be that you're creating an all-island citizens' assembly on a united Ireland. You can start on other issues that are affecting the island, for example, climate and biodiversity. I mean, there is a climate and biodiversity citizens' assembly being formed, but the government missed a massive opportunity in not including people from the north in that citizens' assembly, because, you know, these issues don't stop at the border. I mean, I live 5 miles from the border, so it is, I think, a missed opportunity not to do that. And I think they need to be being more ambitious about creating environments and spaces where citizens from across this island can actually have effective dialogue. Because in my view, we often see in the South a narrative that the North is divided, it's divisive, and people are still, two communities are quite divided. That's not actually the reality on the ground. People are not divided in Northern Ireland in the way that they used to be. I actually think the biggest disconnect on this island is North and South. And I think that in the South, there are quite a lot of outdated stereotypes about Northern Ireland and a lack of understanding. So the Irish government has a responsibility here in terms of trying to break down those barriers, and they could very easily do it.
Yeah. And not just, as you said, a responsibility, but it's an opportunity, you know, and I think you're exactly right that this cross-border stuff, and again, this is all soft diplomacy. Like, the more we get to talk with each other on things that affect us all and that we probably may agree on, you know, without it getting super political, you know, as you said, that the environment is a perfect one, or agricultural policies, all of these things, you know, even tourism, like there's lots of things that we do cooperate on a little bit, you know, but to market, you know, the island as a whole, I think would be very good. So before I just turn it over to the viewers, do you want to talk a little bit about your work on the Women's Council and like what drew you to that, and you know, what kind of issues do you think are facing women of Northern Ireland or Ireland? You know, where are we at with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of them are the same issues across the island. The National Women's Council is an all-island organization. And I went into that space. My role is leadership coordinator, so I deal a lot with politics in terms of trying to get more women into politics and removing barriers for women in that space. And there are systemic barriers that persist. The fact that elected representatives don't get maternity care for maternity leave, for example, is a systemic issue that blocks a lot of women from progressing through their political careers. And the other aspect and a major part of my work with the National Women's Council has been the All-Island Women's Forum. Of course, I went into this role when I started a year and a half or 2 years ago now, very much with the objective of trying to increase North-South cooperation, trying to increase cross-border work, and trying to bring communities together on both sides of the border. So I'm quite passionate about trying to do that. And so the All-Island Women's Forum came to fruition. And what that does is it brings together 14 women from Northern Ireland, 14 from the South, and we meet on a monthly basis to discuss issues that are impacting women across the island. It's been in operation now for a year. We're coming to the end of our first term, and we will then be delivering a set of recommendations to both the Irish government and the Northern Ireland Assembly on issues that we think need to be prioritised. And they're going to be coming through in terms of issues like violence against women, issues in terms of education, and about embedding women's voices in peace building, because we're in a position where 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, women are still not included in these processes. If you look at some committees, for example, the Flags, Identity and Culture Committee that was set up in Stormont had 13 men and 1 woman. So we're not there when it comes to equality of representation. And we know from lots of studies that women's voices are integral to a sustainable and lasting peace. And so a big part of my work is trying to ensure that women are embedded into that process and finding a space where we can be included, because that's a necessary next step. So it's a big passion project for me, and hopefully it'll be going now into the second term, and I can expand the membership. In a way, it's kind of like a mini citizens assembly, but just women.
Yeah, well, it's great, as you say, you know, until we have an equal space at the table, we're going to have our own spaces, you know, first. Yeah. So if any of our participants here or on YouTube have comments or questions, please do so. You can take yourself off mute or just type it in the Q&A. Patty was saying, I think she was kind of agreeing maybe about the flag. She was initially kind of a bit hesitant, but then she said maybe to break away from the church power split. So I do think people, you know, until you've thought of an alternative way of being, you haven't thought about it. And so it seems scary, but of course that's what the dialogue is all about. So Abby or Betty or John, if you have any questions, do either raise your hand or type it in chat or the Q&A here, or as I say, unmute yourself. Abby will actually be giving a talk in July for us on the Orange Order and the history of the order and all of that.
Great.
It's an interesting. Of course, there's Orange Orders in the States too, and across Scotland. So it's more kind of, I think, a little bit of a history, but we do try to mark the July as well. Yeah. So this was great. I don't know. None of them are. I don't think. Oh yeah, good. I don't have a question, but yes, Emma's given a lot of great insight for the talk. Yeah, so that's Abby. Yeah. So Emma, are you optimistic? We should try and end on that. Are you optimistic about Northern Ireland?
Well, I am an optimist at heart. I am one of those really annoying people that just is eternally optimistic, and I haven't been maligned by systemic political failures just yet. I obviously wasn't successful in the election. A lot of people have asked me, oh, would you run again, or blah, 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 blah. And I'm just like, yeah, I'd totally run again. It was great. I really enjoyed the process. Am I optimistic about,
like, you believe in represented? I'm looking at your Twitter. It's you believe firmly that people should have a right to have their voices heard and to be represented properly and correctly. And so I think, even if you're not successful, you move the dialogue. You move the needle on what we're talking about.
Trying a little tiny bit, but in terms of some of the other issues we are facing, it can be quite challenging. We do have a lot of legislation that is coming through the British Parliament at the moment that does cause concern. Okay. If you look at the Elections Act, which came through earlier this year, that poses a potential risk in terms of the Article 2 non-diminution of rights under the Northern Ireland Protocol. If you look at the Legacy Bill, that's unilaterally departing from the Stormont House Agreement and also represents a potential breach of Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights. If you look then to the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, that's potentially going to breach international law. We have the British Bill of Rights that came out today, and that is looking like it's going to try and potentially undermine the operation of the European Convention of Human Rights, which of course then would be undermining the Good Friday Agreement. So I'm optimistic all the time, but also you have to go through and scrutinize really quite challenging and complex pieces of legislation. And when you look back over the past 6 months even, there has been such a high volume of legislation tabled in Parliament, in the House of Commons, that actually does destabilize the peace process, that creates really significant problems for us here in terms of adhering to human rights conventions, and also even the Borders and Nationality Bill too. I mean, it brings forward the concept of an ETA, which I know you have in the US, because I get one every time I'm coming over too, but the idea of an electronic travel authorization operating on the island of Ireland is completely unworkable, and they're going to bring forward this process anyway and force people who fall outside the remit and have to get advanced travel authorization to do that, to cross the border. And the reality of border living here in Ireland is that people cross the border as part of their everyday lives. They do it for groceries, for education, for work. And so the idea that people would have to get pre-authorization to cross the border is totally unworkable. And of course, the British government is saying, oh, but we won't enforce it. But the reality is the legislation actually says that if someone does this and they haven't got pre-authorization, they can face 4 years in prison. Yeah. So it's a criminal offense, and it puts people in a very uncertain legal space that, it is not good for people, will fall through the cracks. Yeah, so there's lots of concerns also around the operation of the common travel area. And so in that sense, it is quite difficult for those of us who are trying very hard to see progress made on delivering on human rights. And I'm conscious, we're looking at the Good Friday Agreement next year. It's going to be the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Mm-hmm. And I really want to see this being an opportunity for people to recommit themselves and redouble their efforts to reconciliation and peace building on this island. I think there can be a tendency to go, oh, the Good Friday Agreement was a great success. Let's all pat ourselves on the back. But it's a process, and there is so much work that still needs to be done. And I think this anniversary next year is a real moment for us to have a serious conversation over what does the next generation have to do to see this through? So I think that we have a lot of challenges ahead, but we'll get there together.
Now, Emma, not to prolong this, but in terms of those legislation pieces that are up and coming through the British government, is that yet again like an example of them just kind of not thinking through the fact that this will have a different impact on the Northern Irish state, or is it a deliberate move to try to destabilize the Good Friday Agreement or the Brexit thing, so that the United Kingdom can move forward with its own separate little bubble? It's hard to know like whether they're doing it deliberately or kind of foolishly.
Well, it's not like they don't know that it exists. But if you look at, suppose they don't have a good track record. If you look at Dominic Raab, for example, I mean, it's infamous. Of course, it is infamous when he was Brexit minister and he was interrogated by Sylvia Herman, who is sorely missed. She was an independent unionist MP for Northern Ireland, and she was interrogating him over the Good Friday Agreement, and he admitted in that committee that he hadn't read the Good Friday Agreement at 30 odd pages, and he was using it as a reference tool, and that it wasn't a cracking read that you sit down with over the summer holidays. So this was someone who was in a space where they were negotiating the Brexit negotiations, the outcomes for Northern Ireland, and they hadn't read what is actually a very accessible document. The Good Friday Agreement was written in a way that it's very accessible. It was given to every household on the island, so people could process the information. And this is something that does cause concern, then, that we have ministers that are not taking the seriousness of the Good Friday Agreement. They're not taking it serious. And I think that it's hard to know how much of it is deliberative. If we look at the Bill of Rights that came out today, it's very focused on trying to prioritize and push forward the current government's agenda. It's focused on trying to remove the powers of the European Court of Justice because they intervened on their deportation plans to try and shift asylum seekers to Rwanda. But of course, that's going to be very difficult for them to do because the ECHR and its operation in Northern Ireland is essential for the Good Friday Agreement. And I think they're struggling to prioritize their own wants and needs in terms of bringing forward this quite hard right agenda, where it's attacking lots of principles like free speech and the right to protest and the right to access courts and justice. And they're trying to find a way to do that without outright just destroying the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety. And I think that's quite challenging for them. So it's a bit of both. It's them trying to push forward their own selfish agenda, and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland being an afterthought. And then when they're reminded, it's a case of them trying to find a way to get around it.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of sorry to leave it on that note, but this has been, as Betty says, a fascinating presentation on the current situation. She said it, reflects what she's hearing herself from her family. Her cousins live in Northern Ireland, and of course, enjoying the open border and traveling throughout the south. As I said, trade is definitely up, and as you said, those opportunities for companies to supply SuperValu and Lidl and all these things. That it's easier to get it now on the island than it is to bring it in. So hopefully those kind of soft opportunities, hopefully will oil, things for other changes to happen. So thank you so much, Emma. I'm sorry that you weren't elected. I think you would have been an amazing representative for your constituency down there in Fermanagh, even though you're a Derry girl. But hopefully there'll be plenty of those cross-border, I think, opportunities are amazing for the island and for women to have a seat at the table. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's super late at home, so I appreciate you staying on.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks. And we're back next Wednesday with Kieran Riley and Kieran and his name is gone. It's about St. Peter's Church downtown and Cornelius Heaney, and he was the poor man that arranged it. But anyway, I'll write the description properly. So thank you, Emma. I'll be in touch with you again. I'm sure we might have you back on. Abby will be giving a talk in July up at Celtic Hall about the Orange Order. And thanks to everyone for joining us both on YouTube and here on Zoom. And take care. Oh yes, Patty said it would be great to see Ireland one country, but because of the hurt from the past, as she was taught in the loss of culture and language, the idea of moving forward is appealing. To be honest, I think that will be very freeing for everybody. It's an interesting thing. Ireland has had this the 10 years, the decade of centenaries, and it is very interesting. I think partly, you know, we went into this with all rah sort of thing in 1916, and you know, the more you're kind of celebrating things, you're realizing, oh, look at all the women who were involved at the start, and then we're suddenly not involved in you know, in politics or in the founding of the state and all of these mother and baby homes. And so, you know, I think there's an opportunity for kind of healing and drawing a line that, like, it was, you know, a civil war situation, they did the best they could, but actually, you know, maybe we do want a different Ireland from the one that we were kind of handed, you know. And so I think we should see the positive in that, and I think you were right to bring that up, Emma.
Yeah,
So
I
thanks
mean, look,
everyone.
just one final thing just to say on
Sorry.
that. I can't help myself. I have to say it before we go. Is just that, you know, the thing about a United Ireland and going into that space is it will actually force our governments to have to change. Because the reality is we are suffering from systemic failures on both sides of the border. You know, the NHS is talked up as a massive success, but it is, you know, at breaking point in terms of people being able to access services. And if you look at the education system in the South, you know, the primary schools still remain, you know, 93% state funded, but Catholic Church run. So the idea of having to create a new constitution, a new Ireland, it forces us to break down all of those policies, all of those systems, all of those structures, and change them. So it sounds pretty good to me.
Absolutely, you know, and as you said, with consultation with the people, you know, we'd be making an informed choice, you know, as opposed to, oh, we can't be. I think the last government, you know, the 100 years ago was, we just don't want to be seen as English. We have to set ourselves up as separate, and so part of that meant, you know, absolutely embracing a Catholic identity, and that may not suit who we are anymore, you know. So But yeah,
All right.
so perfect. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone, and thank you, Emma, and we'll be in touch again. Take care.